why small businesses lose their best employees, and how you can fix it with the 3 Ps. It's the top 3 techniques that one of our clients used to reduce annual turnover by over 63% last year. And we're going to go through what these 3 Ps are in order from least effective to most effective. So let's dive straight in. So in third place, the third best method that we can use to reduce turnover is all about reviewing the pay of our employees. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to close this and we're going to handwrite some notes on this section. So when it comes to how much we pay our employees and why it is one of the biggest triggers for why they may want to leave working with you, is because you need to make sure you are constantly assessing 2 things as the employer. The first thing you want to be constantly assessing is the skills that the employee brings to whatever role that they're in, and the value that they bring to the business, or how much profit or how much revenue can be directly tied to them. And again, if there is a perception that pay for an employee is not fair, well then that is the number one reason why they would then jump ship and they will go and apply for other roles. So when it comes to skills and values, there are 2 things that we need to measure. So when it comes to skills, we need to make sure it is internally fair. So their pay for their skills is internally fair. So as an employer, we need to check 2 things. Are we privileging people who have been with us for longer compared to only those who have recently joined? And are we privileging those with more experience and more higher of a skill set compared to others? So you need to make sure as the leader, we're not just basing this off a resume, we're building relationships with our team so we can ensure that we're constantly reviewing and monitoring pay. Because again, the second that there is a semblance of unfairness between employees' pays will be one of the number 1 reasons why they'll go. And a common mistake that we'll see is that an employee will come to you and say, look, I found a position at this other company where I'm able to be offered a 20% raise. And then what we see is small business owners will scramble trying to outdo that bid. And 99 times out of 100, it's way too late at that point, because at the end of the day, the relationship comes first. Pay is only the 3rd most important factor. So skills, we've got to measure internally, is the pay of your employees fair? In terms of the value that your employees bring to your business, we need to check that it is externally fair. So what we want to do is we want to have some market research going, or our network connections with other like companies and similar industries in our business. What we want to do is make sure, are our employees being paid along par or similar to other similar positions in other companies? And that just comes from research, and it comes from making sure that we are really clear as to where is the progressional journey of our employee. Are we building them up to go towards a leadership position, or are we building them up to be an expert within their field? Either way, we need to do some background research either via online job boards like Seek and websites like that, or talking to our industry connections and networks to see what are the conditions of people in similar roles in other companies. So this is the first thing that we need to do. So what I'm going to do is let's jump back to our whiteboard. Let's take a screenshot of that, and then we can drag this down, and then we've got our pay locked in. So the second thing that we need to do to make sure that we are maximizing our retention with our employees is all about this thing called progression. So let's now dive straight back into our notes. So for progression, again, there are 2 things that we need to have as business owners to ensure that our employees feel like they've got a sense of progression. And we have short-term progression. We also have long-term progression. I'm going to start with the long-term because that is the more common of the 2. And I'm going to use it as a point because what we find as a common mistake is 99% of business owners will only focus on long-term progression, but they'll completely forget about short-term progression. And this is a huge missed opportunity for so many businesses in the world today. So when it comes to long-term progression, it's similar to the pay from above. This is referring to raises and promotions. Because if you imagine for an employee, they only have 2 options for their future within your business. So when it comes to, we'll call this employee, as they progress in their role and they become more advanced in their skill set and they contribute more value to your business, either they're going to go to a leadership role, a promotional role, Or what they're going to do is they're going to become an expert in their field, an expert in their role, and therefore they have higher productivity. Maybe their work is done to a higher standard, so therefore there might be another way for them to have an increase in pay. Now, when it comes to progression, you need to be having real strong one-to-one relationships with your employees, and you only develop those by having regular one-to-one meetings. Common mistake we see is that the one-to-one meetings don't really happen until quarterly performance reviews. Really unacceptable when it comes to maximizing retention. So what you want to do as a business owner is have regular one-to-one meetings and really unpack with the employees in terms of their progression in their career. Do they see themselves going down a leadership pathway, or do they see themselves going down an expert pathway? And then what you need to do as a leader is you need to articulate where their current skill set is and where the ideal future skill set is for an expert or a leader, and have regular check-ins and KPIs and goals that can help them progress towards that. If an employee feels like they have a future mapped out with you in your business, that is going to be another reason for them to stick around. That's going to really heighten a sense of loyalty. But the more potent one that we see is all about the short-term progression. And the key word here is something that sparks fear in so many business owners' minds, and it's this idea of feedback. Employees want to know on a daily and weekly basis where they stand with you as the leader, where they stand with their peers, and where they stand with their clients. And the only way for them to have an honest sense of this is by giving feedback. Because the alternative is if you're waiting for quarterly performance reviews to really address and bring up something, in the interim, the employee is going to be looking at your body language or your tone of voice, or maybe some gossip and maybe other toxic behaviors amongst the peers that may arise, because they're wanting to seek some sort of validation that they're going on the right track. But if there's no formal feedback process, then they're going to look in all the wrong places to get that. That's not their fault. They're hungry for feedback, but they're going to get it from an inaccurate source that will dilute the quality of a reason why they should stay with you. And I need you to understand as well, the top retention tool for business owners is giving feedback. If you're celebrating the great work that the employee does, and you're giving them opportunities for improvement for how they can even become better at what they're doing and being in the top 1% of other people in their role across the world, that is a reason for the employee to stick around, because they can understand that they have short-term check-ins, but it also gets mapped out to a long-term vision. Now, when it comes to feedback, there are two things that you can do as an employer, and this is where we see a lot of hesitation in industry. Because what we can do as employers, we can observe an employee do an action, and we can do one of two things. We can either reinforce the action so we see more of it, or we can redirect the action so we see less of it. Reinforcing the action is something that we want to do when we see something that's desirable. It really helps to sell our values and grow our business. And we want to redirect things that are undesirable, they are below our expectation. And the number one thing that we see as a mistake is that we give redirect, we give feedback so much more than we celebrate the good. And what I want to challenge you as a business owner is to get really good at giving feedback. There was some great research done back in 2004 from Heafy and Lasada that found that you need to give positive feedback 5 times more than you give constructive feedback. Because otherwise what the employee will feel is that you're catching them doing bad rather than doing good. You want to find things that really align with your business values or parts of excellence in their role, and you really want to highlight that and celebrate it. That's going to make it so much more acceptable that when you do give constructive feedback, it's heard constructively and it's not taken as an insult. And speaking of insult, that's the second most common mistake that we see with feedback. In the times that you do give constructive feedback, it comes across as an insult or a punishment. It may come across as the employee dwelling on a mistake in the past, and they stay stuck rather than move forward. And so the easiest way to understand what good quality constructive feedback looks like is when you're speaking to the employee, just articulate the difference between where they're at and where the ideal is and what they can do next time to achieve it, rather than what they did and comparing it to something that's below expectation and make them feel bad and stay stuck and not want to improve. If you say, next time I'd like you to try this to get you to the next level, to meet your long-term goals of either being an expert or a leader, you position feedback like that, it will always come across fantastically. So let's now go back to our whiteboard. We'll take a screenshot of this and then we'll drag it down. And that is our second. Oop, not sure what happened there. So second is progression. So when it comes to our first place retention tool for business owners, it is one that is not commonly known and it's not commonly spoken about in business. So in first place, it's all about this thing called psychological safety, and I'll just abbreviate it to psych safety. So let's come back to here. For psych safety, what we need to do is we need to make sure we get really good at breaking negative perception patterns. And this is how you can think about it. When an employee feels negatively triggered, okay, and they could feel negatively triggered for a million different reasons. And sometimes it may be valid and accurate, or sometimes those triggers may be based on an incorrect assumption. Irrespective of that, when an employee feels triggered, if they feel triggered once, we call that an incident. When an employee feels triggered in the same way, so let's say, for example, one of their peers speaks to them in a perceived negative tone. If that type of interaction happens twice, we call that a coincidence. If that same type of perceived negative trigger happens 3 or more times, then to the mind of an employee, that is known as a pattern. It's a pattern of behavior. It's something that they can expect to continue moving forward. And what they then do is once they have a pattern of perceived negative triggers, employees have one of 4 options to take. Okay? One of 4 options to take. The first 3 options are all around our innate human survival instincts. So these are known as either flight responses or fight responses. And I'm going to write these down here. Now, there are 2 flight responses an employee can take to a pattern of perceived negative triggers, and there is 1 fight response. The first flight response that we see is known as a silence response. It's when you've got an employee who feels like another of their colleagues no longer trusts them. So what their response is moving forward is they're going to avoid conversations, avoid interacting with that person. They're going to withhold information, or they're going to dilute down their opinions and try to minimize themselves. And they do this in the hopes that the problem will go away, or the person will leave, or the leader, i.e. you as the business owner, will go ahead and solve the problems for them. And 99 times out of 100, this does not constructively fix the problem. I'm going to skip the second flight response and we'll go down to the fight response. And this one, quite simply, is a violent response. So if there is a perception that a peer no longer trusts you, you might see this come out as threatening or labeling or attacking, or potentially even verbal abuse, which might lead down to performance conversations and performance management. I think we all know what type of violence responses we see to a perceived pattern of negative triggers. The fourth one, before I talk about the flight response, is known as constructive dialogue. This is one that we rarely see in the workplace, and it's the only real productive solution, where you as a leader can actually sit down and have a hard conversation with that employee to unpack this pattern of negative triggers. And what you can achieve out of having constructive dialogue is either for you as the leader to solve the problem, depending on what it is, or to raise the constructive dialogue skills with your employees so they can feel empowered to resolve it on their own. But most of the time that doesn't happen. So what you can do as a leader is you can hold them accountable to that. So say, for example, that you've got an employee that comes to you and they feel like there is a loss of trust with another employee. Now, there is nothing that you hear from their second-hand report that is alarming to you from a performance conversation and a performance management perspective. So you can say to this person, I think that this is something that's well within your skill set to create a really constructive relationship out of. And I don't want to come in and rescue the situation because it's going to put you in an even worse situation. So now let's workshop how you could have that conversation, and I really want you to have a go. And if that person comes back to you with a concern that the relationship hasn't improved, and you ask them, well, did you have the chat like we spoke about? And they say no. Well, then you can set that as an expectation. Completely reasonable to do. Because the fourth option, other than silence, violence, or constructive dialogue, which is the most commonly taken one, is for the employee to resign. They run away from the situation entirely. They don't want to fix it, they don't feel like it can be fixed, and so they'll just leave the business altogether. And so if you can try and channel things down into the constructive dialogue space, that's going to really help you retain your employees the most. Now, in saying all of this, how do you know whether there is a perceived pattern of negative triggers that one of your employees is facing? Again, it goes back to what we spoke about in progression. Build a great one-on-one relationship with the employee. Have weekly check-in meetings, have weekly one-to-ones. And in those meetings, ask them, what are your biggest bottlenecks that you're facing at the moment? And what are your biggest challenges at work or even outside of work? Because again, some of these triggers might also be outside of work related. And you don't know what you don't know as a business leader. And quite often it comes too late when someone's already given you a resignation letter and we're scrambling together to try and convince them to stay. But what you do as a leader instead is be proactive, engage in conversation. So that way you do know what you don't know. And with that, we can now map together our final section here, and we've got our final piece of the puzzle. So overall, we know that pay, progression, and psych safety are the three tactics that you have in your leadership toolkit for businesses to be able to retain their employees for 2, 3, 4, or maybe even 5 times longer than an employee may have stayed with you. Thanks for watching.